Marcus Chen stood at the weather station computer screen, watching the satellite images rotate like a hypnotic death spiral. Red and orange swirls painted the monitor in colors that made veteran meteorologists shake their heads. The storm system approaching the Himalayas was unlike anything they had seen in 15 years of mountain weather tracking. "Sir, you need to see this," called Sarah Winters, the lead meteorologist at base camp. Her voice carried the kind of tension that made experienced climbers stop what they were doing and listen. She pointed to the screen where wind speeds showed readings that shouldn't exist at 20,000 feet. "We're looking at sustained winds of over 100 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 140. The temperature will drop to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. This isn't just a storm, Marcus. This is a killing machine." Marcus rubbed his weathered face, feeling the familiar weight of command decisions. At 52, he had led more high-altitude expeditions than most climbers attempted in their entire careers. His team respected him because he brought people home alive. But this expedition was different. This wasn't about conquering peaks or personal glory. 3 climbers were trapped at Camp 4 on the north face of Everest, running out of time and oxygen. The weather window for rescue was closing fast, and this storm would seal it shut for weeks. "What's the timeline?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer would be bad news. Sarah consulted her charts and computer models. "The storm hits the mountain in 18 hours. Once it arrives, it will park there for at least 5 days. Maybe 7. Those winds will make helicopter rescue impossible. Ground rescue teams won't be able to move above base camp. If someone is still up there when this thing hits—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. The 3 trapped climbers were part of an international expedition that had been caught off guard when their Sherpa guides became seriously ill. Without experienced local support, they had become stranded at 26,000 feet, unable to descend safely on their own. Their radio communications had been spotty, but the last message was clear. They had perhaps 48 hours of oxygen remaining, and one member of their team was showing signs of severe altitude sickness. Marcus walked to the large map mounted on the wall of their planning tent. Red pins marked the location of the stranded climbers, while blue pins showed the positions of potential rescue teams. The geography told the story that everyone already knew, but nobody wanted to say out loud. The distance from base camp to Camp 4 was manageable under normal conditions, but with the approaching storm, it would become a journey into hell. "We have 3 options," Marcus announced to the assembled team of climbers and rescue specialists. "We can wait for the storm to pass and hope the stranded climbers survive that long. We can attempt a helicopter rescue in the next few hours before conditions deteriorate completely. Or we can send a ground team up the mountain now, knowing they'll be climbing directly into the worst storm in recent memory." The helicopter option was eliminated within minutes. High-altitude rescue pilot Jenny Rodriguez had already run the calculations. "The winds are already too strong at altitude," she explained. "My bird can't maintain stable flight above 18,000 feet in these conditions. If I try to reach Camp 4, I'll end up as another rescue case myself." That left waiting or going. The room fell silent as everyone considered the mathematics of survival. The stranded climbers might last 2 more days if they were lucky and careful with their remaining oxygen. The storm would last at least 5 days. The math was simple and brutal. "There's a 4th option," said David Park, the team's most experienced high-altitude climber. At 38, David had summited Everest 6 times and had never lost a team member. "We go up now, before the storm hits. We reach the stranded climbers and set up for survival operations. Instead of trying to get everyone down before the storm arrives, we prepare to weather the storm at altitude and descend when it passes." The suggestion was met with the kind of silence that follows truly dangerous ideas. Intentionally staying at 26,000 feet during a massive storm was not rescue strategy. It was suicide planning. "The death zone isn't called that for poetry," said Tom Wilson, the team's medical officer. The human body cannot survive extended periods above 25,000 feet, even with supplemental oxygen. You're talking about asking rescue climbers to spend a week in conditions that kill people in hours. David spread detailed topographical maps across the planning table. Camp 4 has some shelter structures that previous expeditions built. If we can reinforce them and bring additional survival equipment, we might be able to create a survivable environment. The key is having enough oxygen, food, and fuel to last through the storm. Marcus studied the maps while calculating loads and timelines. The plan David was proposing was theoretically possible, but practically insane. It would require carrying massive amounts of additional equipment up the mountain, including extra oxygen tanks, cold weather gear, emergency shelters, food, fuel, and medical supplies. The weight alone would slow their ascent and increase the physical demands on the rescue team. "How many climbers would we need to send?" Marcus asked. "Minimum of 6, David replied. 2 to help the stranded climbers descend when conditions improve, 2 to carry and set up survival equipment, and 2 as backup in case someone becomes injured or incapacitated during the operation." The more they discussed the plan, the more complex it became. They would need to establish supply caches at multiple camps along the route, ensuring that the rescue team had access to food and fuel throughout their extended stay on the mountain. They would need backup oxygen systems in case primary tanks failed or were damaged. They would need emergency medical supplies capable of treating altitude sickness, frostbite, and trauma injuries. "This isn't a rescue mission," observed Lisa Chen, the expedition's logistics coordinator. "This is a siege operation. You're talking about establishing a forward base in the death zone and holding it against the worst weather the mountain can throw at you." The comparison was apt. Military siege operations required careful planning, extensive supplies, and the ability to endure harsh conditions for extended periods. The rescue team would be essentially under attack by the mountain itself, fighting for survival while trying to keep 3 other people alive. "We'll need to start moving supplies immediately," Marcus decided. "Even if we decide this plan is too dangerous, we need to have equipment positioned on the mountain in case the situation changes." The next several hours became a frenzy of preparation activity. Equipment that had been carefully packed for standard climbing operations was repacked for extended survival scenarios. Additional oxygen tanks were hauled from storage and tested. Cold weather gear was inspected and reinforced. Food supplies were calculated and recalculated to ensure adequate nutrition for 9 people during a week-long ordeal. The communications team established relay stations to maintain contact with the stranded climbers and monitor their condition. Every few hours, scratchy radio transmissions brought updates from Camp 4. The news was consistently bad. One of the trapped climbers was developing pulmonary edema, a potentially fatal condition where fluid accumulates in the lungs due to altitude exposure. Without immediate descent or medical intervention, he would likely die within days. "We're running out of time to make this decision," Sarah announced during an evening weather briefing. "The storm is moving faster than initially predicted. We now have approximately 12 hours before conditions become impassable." Marcus gathered his core team for a final planning session. The decision before them was stark. Attempt the rescue mission knowing it would likely result in additional casualties, or abandon the stranded climbers and accept that they would probably die. "I've been doing mountain rescue for 20 years, Marcus told the group. "I've seen good people make bad decisions and die because of it. I've also seen impossible rescues succeed because someone was willing to take calculated risks. This storm is giving us advance warning, which is more than most mountain disasters provide. We know exactly what we're facing and exactly when it will arrive." David spread out a detailed timeline on the table. "If we leave base camp at midnight, we can reach Camp 2 by dawn. From there, it's a 6-hour climb to Camp 3, another 4 hours to Camp 4. That puts us at the rescue site by mid-afternoon, giving us several hours to assess the situation and begin storm preparations before the weather deteriorates completely." The plan required precise execution. The rescue team would climb in 3 pairs, with each pair carrying specific equipment loads and having defined responsibilities. The first pair would focus on reaching the stranded climbers quickly and providing immediate medical assistance. The second pair would carry heavy survival equipment and establish the reinforced shelter systems. The third pair would serve as backup support and maintain communications with base camp. "What about descent planning?" asked Tom. "Even if everyone survives the storm, getting 9 people down from Camp 4 in post-storm conditions won't be easy." "We'll have to assess conditions after the storm passes," Marcus replied. "Depending on snow accumulation and continued wind, we might need to descend in stages, potentially spending additional nights at lower camps." As the planning session continued past midnight, the scope of the operation became clear. They weren't just planning a rescue mission, they were planning what amounted to a military operation in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Success would require perfect execution, exceptional teamwork, and considerable luck. The final equipment check revealed the magnitude of what they were attempting. 9 climbers would need oxygen for a minimum of 7 days at extreme altitude. That meant carrying over 60 oxygen tanks, each weighing several pounds. Food requirements for 9 people for a week added another significant weight burden. Fuel for cooking and melting snow for drinking water required multiple stoves and fuel canisters. Emergency medical supplies, backup communications equipment, additional climbing gear, and reinforced shelter materials brought the total equipment load to over 2,000 pounds. Distributing that weight among 6 rescue climbers meant each person would be carrying loads far exceeding normal climbing recommendations. In good conditions, such loads would slow progress and increase fatigue. In the approaching storm conditions, the additional weight could mean the difference between life and death. "This is the kind of operation that gets written about in mountain rescue journals," observed Lisa. "Either as an example of heroic success or as a case study in how good intentions can multiply casualties." The truth of her statement settled over the planning tent like a heavy blanket. Everyone present understood they were contemplating something far beyond the scope of normal rescue operations. Military special forces trained for months before attempting operations with similar risk profiles. The rescue team was preparing to launch in hours. At 3 in the morning, Marcus made the final decision. "We go. The risk to the rescue team is significant, but the certainty of death for the stranded climbers makes the decision clear. We prepare for a recovery mission, not a quick rescue. Everyone needs to understand that once we commit to this plan, we're all in it together until the storm passes." The next hour was spent on final preparations and safety briefings. Each team member reviewed their specific responsibilities and backup plans. Emergency protocols were established for various scenarios, from equipment failure to medical emergencies to complete communication breakdown with base camp. As dawn approached, the rescue team began their final equipment checks and personal preparations. Each climber tested their oxygen systems, verified their cold weather gear, and reviewed their assigned equipment loads. The weight of what they were about to attempt was visible in everyone's faces, but so was the determination to bring the stranded climbers home alive. Marcus stood at the edge of base camp, looking up at the mountain that was about to test everyone's limits. The sky was still clear, but weather monitoring equipment showed the approaching storm system growing stronger as it moved toward their position. In 12 hours, the mountain would become a battleground. The question was whether skill, preparation, and determination would be enough to win against forces far beyond human control. The universe had indeed warned them this was a dead man's journey. Their response was to prepare for recovery, not retreat. In the history of mountain rescue, such decisions often marked the difference between tragedy and triumph. They would know which category their efforts belonged to within the week. The headlamps of 6 climbers bobbed like fireflies against the dark mountain face as Marcus Chen's rescue team began their ascent at precisely midnight. The temperature at base camp was already minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and it would only get colder as they climbed higher. Each team member carried loads that would have been challenging under normal conditions. With the approaching storm, the extra weight felt like carrying death itself up the mountain. David Park led the first rope team, moving with the mechanical precision that came from 2 decades of high-altitude climbing. Behind him, Medical Officer Tom Wilson struggled with his heavy pack loaded with emergency medical supplies and additional oxygen tanks. Every 100 feet of elevation gain made their loads feel heavier and their breathing more labored. "Radio check," Marcus called over the team communication system. "All teams report status." "Team 1, on schedule," David responded, his voice slightly breathless from exertion. "Making good time despite the loads." "Team 2 falling slightly behind," reported Lisa Chen, who was climbing with communications specialist Jake Roberts. "Jake's having some trouble with his pack distribution." "Team 3, steady pace," confirmed backup climber Michael Torres, climbing with equipment specialist Anna Petrova. "Equipment is secure, no issues so far." The first few hours of climbing passed without major incident, but everyone could feel the mountain's mood changing. The wind was picking up steadily, and the temperature continued dropping even faster than weather predictions had indicated. By the time they reached Camp 1 at 19,000 feet, frost was forming on their goggles and face masks. "Storm system is moving faster than predicted," Marcus announced during a brief rest stop. "Weather station reports we now have approximately 8 hours before conditions become severe, not 12. The news meant they would have to move faster while carrying heavier loads at altitude. It was exactly the kind of compound challenge that turned difficult climbs into deadly ones. David checked his watch and calculated distances to key waypoints. They were slightly behind schedule, but still within acceptable parameters if nothing else went wrong. "We push harder from here," Marcus decided. "Shorter rest stops, faster climbing pace. Anyone experiencing serious difficulty needs to speak up now, before it becomes critical." The climb from Camp 1 to Camp 2 normally took experienced climbers about 4 hours. With their heavy loads and deteriorating conditions, the rescue team needed nearly 6 hours to cover the same distance. By the time they reached Camp 2 at 21,000 feet, everyone was showing signs of serious fatigue. Tom Wilson was particularly struggling with the altitude and load combination. As the team's medical officer, he was carrying the heaviest pack filled with emergency medical equipment that might mean the difference between life and death for the stranded climbers. But the weight was taking a severe toll on his climbing performance. "Tom, you need to redistribute some of that medical gear," David suggested during their rest stop at Camp 2. "You're moving slower than safe climbing speed for these conditions. If we lighten the medical load and someone has a serious injury, we might not be able to treat them effectively," Tom replied, though his exhaustion was obvious. Marcus made the command decision. "Anna, you take half of Tom's medical supplies. Tom, you take some of Anna's climbing gear. We need everyone moving at safe speeds, especially with the weather deteriorating." The equipment redistribution took precious time, but it was necessary for team safety. While they repacked loads, Sarah Winters radioed from base camp with updated weather information that made everyone's blood run cold. "Marcus, the storm has intensified significantly. We're now showing wind speeds at altitude exceeding 150 miles per hour. The temperature at Camp 4 is already minus 40 degrees and dropping fast. You've got maybe 6 hours before conditions become unsurvivable." 6 hours to reach Camp 4. Assess the stranded climbers and set up survival operations before nature unleashed its full fury. The timeline was tight enough to be terrifying, but still theoretically possible if everything went perfectly. Nothing went perfectly. 2 hours above Camp 2, Jake Roberts developed symptoms of acute mountain sickness. Nausea, severe headache, and disorientation meant he was becoming a liability to himself and his climbing partner. In normal rescue operations, he would descend immediately to lower altitude. But there was no time for anyone to escort him down, and the approaching storm made solo descent impossibly dangerous. "Jake needs to continue upward with us," Tom determined after a quick medical assessment. "Descending alone in his condition would be suicide, and we can't spare anyone to accompany him down. We'll have to treat his altitude sickness at Camp 4 and hope he improves once we're in shelter." The decision violated basic mountain safety protocols, but the approaching storm had eliminated most of their safe options. Jake would have to climb higher while seriously ill, increasing his risk of developing life-threatening altitude complications. But leaving him alone to descend in deteriorating weather would be certain death. "Jake, you stay roped directly to me," Lisa decided. "I'll monitor your condition and help you through the difficult sections." The team's pace slowed further as they accommodated Jake's illness. Every delay meant less time for storm preparation once they reached the stranded climbers. The mathematics of survival were shifting against them with each passing hour. 4 hours above Camp 2, the first signs of the approaching storm became physically apparent. The wind speed increased dramatically, making balance difficult and increasing the risk of being blown off the mountain face. Loose snow began swirling in ways that suggested much worse conditions were developing at higher altitudes. "Wind speed at our position is now 40 miles per hour, David reported. "At Camp 4, it's probably already over 70. The stranded climbers hadn't responded to radio calls in over 2 hours. Their silence could mean their radio equipment had failed, their battery power was exhausted, or their condition had deteriorated to the point where communication was impossible. Each explanation was bad news. "We have to assume they're alive but incapacitated," Marcus decided. "When we reach Camp 4, we go directly to their last known position and assess their condition before setting up our own survival operations." The final approach to Camp 4 required climbing through increasingly dangerous conditions. The wind was strong enough to require extra care with each step, and blowing snow was beginning to reduce visibility. The temperature had dropped to -50 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause frostbite within minutes of exposed skin contact. Marcus's team reached Camp 4 just as the storm began showing its true power. The wind was howling with a sound like continuous thunder, and snow was blowing horizontally with enough force to sting exposed skin even through multiple layers of protective clothing. Visibility had dropped to less than 20 feet. "Stranded climbers located," David shouted over the wind. "They're in bad shape." The 3 trapped climbers were huddled in a partially collapsed tent that provided minimal protection from the elements. One was unconscious, showing signs of severe altitude sickness and possible hypothermia. The second was awake but confused and disoriented. The third was alert but suffering from obvious exhaustion and dehydration. "Medical assessment," Tom called out as he reached the stranded team's position. His examination had to be conducted in wind conditions that made detailed work nearly impossible, but the results were clear. 1 critical condition, possible pulmonary edema. 1 serious condition, altitude sickness and mild hypothermia. 1 stable but exhausted. All 3 need immediate shelter and warming. Setting up their reinforced survival shelter in the deteriorating conditions proved to be far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The wind was strong enough to tear equipment from their hands and send it flying into the darkness. Every tent stake had to be hammered into ground that was frozen solid. Guy lines had to be secured with dead man anchors buried deep in the snow and ice. "Shelter construction is taking too long," Marcus realized as he watched his team struggle against the storm. "We need to get everyone inside something more substantial before this gets worse." The existing shelter structures at Camp 4 had been built by previous expeditions, but most were damaged by years of weather exposure and inadequate for the storm they were facing. The rescue team's plan had been to reinforce these structures with their own equipment, but the wind was making construction work nearly impossible. "We combine resources," Anna suggested. "Use the best existing shelter as our base. Reinforce it with our equipment and get everyone inside now. We can improve the structure from inside once we're protected from the direct wind. The improvised shelter construction became a desperate race against time and weather. Each team member had specific responsibilities: securing the structure's frame, installing windproof panels, creating entrance and ventilation systems, and establishing interior space for 9 people plus essential equipment. The work had to be done while wearing heavy gloves in conditions where exposed skin would freeze within minutes. Tools became difficult to handle. Ropes and fabric fought against the wind like living things trying to escape. Several pieces of equipment were lost to the storm despite everyone's best efforts to secure everything. By the time they got all 9 people inside the reinforced shelter, the storm had reached its predicted intensity. The wind was screaming at over 120 miles per hour, and the temperature outside had dropped to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The shelter was shaking and flexing with each gust, but it was holding together. Inside the shelter, the rescue team began the medical work that would determine whether their dangerous journey had been worth attempting. Tom Wilson started treating the most seriously ill of the stranded climbers, using portable oxygen systems and warming protocols to address hypothermia and altitude sickness. His condition is critical, Tom reported. Fluid in the lungs, core body temperature dangerously low, possible cerebral edema. He needs immediate descent to lower altitude, but obviously that's impossible in current conditions. The medical treatment options at 26,000 feet in storm conditions were severely limited. Tom could provide supplemental oxygen, attempt to warm the patient gradually, and administer altitude sickness medications. But the definitive treatment for severe altitude sickness was descent, which wouldn't be possible for days. We keep him stable as long as possible and hope he can survive until descent conditions improve, Tom decided. It's not ideal medical care, but it's the best we can do given the circumstances. The shelter's interior became a carefully organized survival space. Sleeping areas were arranged to maximize warmth sharing and minimize space usage. Cooking and equipment storage areas were designated to reduce the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning and equipment damage. Medical treatment space was established near the oxygen supply systems. "Communication check with base camp," Marcus called to Jake, who was operating their radio equipment despite his continuing altitude sickness symptoms. The radio response was filled with static and interference from the storm, but Sarah's voice was still audible. "Marcus, storm intensity is exceeding all predictions. Wind speeds at your location are now sustained over 130 miles per hour. This is becoming one of the most severe storms in recorded mountain weather history." The news meant their survival timeline had potentially extended beyond their original planning assumptions. Instead of weathering a 5-day storm, they might be trapped for a week or more. Food, fuel, and oxygen supplies that had seemed adequate for 5 days would need to be carefully rationed for potentially longer survival. "We implement strict rationing protocols starting now," Marcus announced. "Food consumption reduced by 20%, fuel usage minimized to essential cooking and warming only, oxygen systems limited to medical necessity, and sleep periods." The first night in the storm tested everyone's endurance and resolve. The shelter flexed and shuddered with each wind gust, creating constant noise that made sleep difficult. The temperature inside the shelter remained barely above freezing despite their body heat and careful use of heating equipment. Every few hours, someone had to venture outside to check the shelter's anchor points and clear snow accumulation that could collapse their protection. These exterior maintenance tasks were extremely dangerous in the storm conditions, requiring safety ropes and multiple backup systems to prevent anyone from being lost in the darkness. "Snow accumulation is becoming a problem," David reported after one of his exterior checks. "We're getting buried faster than anticipated. If this continues, we might not be able to exit the shelter when the storm ends." The possibility of survival followed by death from being trapped under snow added another layer of complexity to their situation. They would need to maintain access routes and prevent complete burial while conserving energy and minimizing exposure to the killing conditions outside. By dawn of the first full day in the storm, everyone understood they were facing something far beyond normal mountain weather. The shelter was holding, but just barely. Equipment was functioning, but with increasing difficulty as extreme cold affected mechanical systems. Most critically, their most seriously ill patient was stable but not improving. This storm is testing the absolute limits of human survival at this altitude, Tom observed during his morning medical rounds. We're operating at the edge of what's possible. The universe had delivered on its warning about this being a dead man's journey, but the rescue team had prepared for recovery, not retreat. Their preparation was being tested by conditions that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. Whether preparation would be enough remained to be determined by forces far beyond their control.